Hello and welcome to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. This will be our last meeting of the fall 2018 semester, and it's been a great one. Today we are having a presentation from Deniz and Alyssa Prorok, who are explaining the design of Civil War peace agreements to us. We're also joined today by a great slate of discussants. Carla Martinez-Machain is an associate professor in the political science department at Kansas State University. Mike Finley, hello Mike.
Hi.
Is a professor of government at the Department of Government and the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Gary Uzzoni is an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee Department of Political Science. And we're also being joined by proxy by Lindsay Reed, who is an assistant professor in political science at UC Davis. She wasn't able to join us in person, but she has sent along her comments, and I will be her proxy in this meeting today. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Deniz, and I want to say congratulations to Alyssa, who just had a baby, and so will not be joining us today.
Thank you, Emily. I'll send all the best wishes to her, and thank you for having us. We're looking forward to your comments. And in this paper, we're examining the design of peace agreements signed following civil wars. And we start with an observation that usually rebel groups make very broad claims at the beginning of the war, claiming to represent larger constituencies or large segments of the population. However, when we look at the terms of peace at the end of wars, there is a great variation in terms of who benefits from peace. And this is true, for example, when we compare the 1993 agreement signed between South African government and the ANC, where there were larger reforms, restructuring the political economic system, the military, and the territorial arrangements. Whereas when we look at the Lomé Accord of 1999, the agreement was much more geared towards benefiting the elite and the leader members of the group. And it included amnesty provisions, and it included payouts to the elites and the leader. So our main research question is what explains variation in terms of the terms of peace following civil wars, and we argue that the rebel leaders who are civilian reliant are more likely to stand firm, signing agreements with broad public benefits, while the rebel leaders who are not civilian reliant will sell out and sign agreements with more group and elite level payoffs and benefits. In the existing literature, we know that the design of the agreements actually is important for the durability of peace and also success of the implementation of these agreements, whereas there are very few, if any, studies problematizing the design of the agreements themselves. And usually these studies also assume that the groups are unitary actors and all the different components of a group benefit from peace agreements equally. However, we argue that there are different audience members and the leaders have to take into account the preferences of these different audience members when they negotiate peace agreements, and sometimes those preferences may be even competing preferences. Namely, we argue that there are constituencies or civilians who are the main supporters of the rebel group. They provide material and non-material support. They may be supporting the cause of the rebel group and also providing food and shelter, and those members, the civilian supporters, are generally preferring. They would generally prefer public goods type of provisions that they would directly benefit from, such as large reforms, where the benefit from those provisions cannot be excluded. Whereas the rank and file members, who are the lower rank members of the rebel group, or the foot soldiers who actually joined the fighting, would likely to prefer benefits that directly benefit them, and the benefits that are based on the membership of the group, like amnesties for the fighters, or reintegration packages, or being integrated into military. And finally, the elite members of the group, who are the higher ranked members, who are in the military and political wing of the group, would prefer certain elite payoffs and maybe positions for themselves in the government or the military, or other economic payoffs. And we argue that the leaders have to make some trade-offs when they negotiate the terms of the peace. And we ask, when are the terms of the peace most likely to reflect the constituents' preferences by including more public goods type of benefits that directly benefit the constituency at large. And we suggest that the leaders generally are the key decision makers, but they have to make some trade-offs as they negotiate the terms of the settlements, because the states, their opponent, will not be willing to give in to every demand that they make, and they make those decisions and trade-offs based on where they derive their main military and political power. In other words, they would try to appease the audience member, one of those three different members that they most rely on. And we suggest that they will design agreements, or try to find agreements that would benefit civilians when they mostly rely on civilians for their military and political power. And there are three reasons for that. One is that the leaders would still want to maintain their military effectiveness and power during negotiations. Even though the fighting is coming to an end, they would like to maintain that power. First of all, because those negotiations happen simultaneously as the ongoing conflict, and they would still want to be able to turn back to conflict in case the negotiations fail. But also their military effectiveness or better power would allow them to have better bargaining position on the table. And therefore, if the group relies on civilians for shelter, for food, for funding and support, then and for the maintenance of the war fighting capability, then the leaders would try to gear the agreements accordingly so that they can keep the support of the civilian constituency. Another reason for this is that when the rebel groups have close ties to the civilians and rely civilians for their funding, then they would also have joint governance structures that influence the decision making within the group. There are several studies showing that the rebel groups have different governance structures, and the ones especially that are resource poor or have homogeneous support base tend to have more joint governance structures that have that value or have channels for civilians to have input in the decision making within the group. And those groups that are also civilian reliant, and in turn we argue would likely to have agreements that have benefits to those civilian constituencies, because the civilian input will be on the table when the agreements are negotiated. And we assume that the civilians would prefer broader benefits as opposed to more group level benefits. And finally, we suggest that the leaders have a longer shadow picture and would like to maintain political power in the post-conflict period. And in order to be able to do that, they would like to maintain their support base, which would likely to become their new electoral constituency once the transition from war to peace is complete. And they would like to appease those civilians by achieving an agreement that benefits them directly. Therefore, we hypothesize that the civilian-reliant rebel leaders will reach peace agreements with a greater proportion of public benefits than rebel leaders who are not civilian-reliant. While we argue that the relationship between civilians and the rebel groups is a determinant of the design of the agreement. We also think that there are alternative factors that and explanations that may affect the design of the agreement. And one of those is who is on the other side of the table, the influence of government leaders, because we assume that the government state leaders also care about the costs of concessions made to the rebels, and we think that the regime type is likely to determine baseline costs of making broader concessions, especially that change the political system or change the economic system and distribution of resources. And we think that the democratic leaders may be more willing to make more public goods type of concessions compared to other leaders of personalistic regimes, because the costs of making some concessions on the political system may be less for the democratic leaders. And also we think that the presence of other active rebel groups may also alter the incentives of the state leaders to make concessions. And another factor is the influence of third-party mediators. Again, we think that the agreements mediated by third parties may be systematically different than the agreements that are not. And especially we think that the different types of mediators may have varying effects on the design of the agreement. One thing we know from the literature is that the NGOs and grassroots organizations have usually a better knowledge of the local context and closer relation to the civilians. So we expect that those types of mediators are more likely to promote for public goods type of provisions that benefit the civilians as opposed to other types of mediators like states or IOs. In order to test this argument, we use new data on the terms of the settlement. And this data comes from the implementation of peace agreements data set that I collected for my dissertation, and it covers the years, all the agreements, all final agreements signed between 1989 and 2009. And we go over all the provisions in those agreements and code which provision benefits which group within the rebel group, from leader to elite to rank and file members and to the public. And we coded in a way that in some cases, each provision might benefit multiple audience members, which can happen. And we use two different coding rules and two alternative DVs. One is a more strict coding rule where we look at only the provisions that directly benefit that audience, or explicitly there's an explicit mention that the provision will benefit or directly benefiting, let's say, to the leader. And then the other alternative coding rule is a little bit more relaxed, inclusive coding rule where we take into account potential probabilistic benefits to one of the constituencies as an extension of that provision. And our main DV then is the aggregation of those benefits, and we get a ratio that ranges from 0 to 1 in terms of the proportion of provisions that benefits the public over the all the provisions that had a concession to the rebel group. And when measuring the reliance of the civilian, reliance of the rebel group on civilians, we use 3 proxies. One is whether or not the rebel group rely on ethnic support, and we use data from the ethnic power relations and code if a rebel group claims to represent an ethnic group, receives support from that ethnic group, and recruits from that ethnic group. 37% of our observations are coded 1 in this case. And the other proxy is, does the rebel group have access to external sanctuary? We use the USDP external support data with the idea that the external bases will allow rebel to have their operations and maintain their operations outside the country of conflict, and which would imply that a weaker relationship between the civilians in the country and the rebel group. And 46% of the observations are coded as having external sanctuary. And finally, we'll look at contraband funding, again with the idea that the presence of contraband funding might suggest that there's a weaker relationship between the civilians and the rebel groups, and we use the new rebel contraband data set to code this information.
There's about 3 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll quickly go to the models. We run a fractional response model using both DVs, both versions of the DV, and we had some robustness checks looking at the Hencken selection models and using matching to address non-random selection into settlement and non-randomness of the reliance on civilians. And we control, as I talk in the external alternative explanations, for conflict characteristics, third-party involvement during negotiations, and state characteristics. And we find that, in fact, the ethnic support groups that rely on ethnic support are significantly more likely to have agreements that benefits public or agreements with provisions that have public good benefits. And we also find, as expected, that the groups with external sanctuary are significantly less, have signed on to agreements that have less benefits to the public. And these, both of these variables are in the expected direction and significant in various different models that we run, including alternative specifications of the DV. And we also find, as expected, that the contraband funding also lowers the public benefits proportion in an agreement, but we do not find across the board a significant effect for this variable. And there are potential measurement issues with this variable that we discuss a little bit in the paper, and I can go into in detail if there are any questions on that. But I'll move to the conclusions. And it seems that we, in fact, see that the civilian reliance affect the design of the agreements and produce more agreements with more public benefits. And this likely to have implications for other outcomes of interest, such as implementation and agreement durability. And we intend to reconsider how we code contraband funding, or if we can improve some of that data, and also explore latent variable modeling to capture underlying reliance of civilians by using different measures. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we'll turn it over to our discussants. Who would like to get started? Gary.
Okay, thank you for that presentation and having us be discussants on this paper. So one of the things that I was wondering about in the theory is that you're thinking about getting public provisions as standing firm. And so I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the different characteristics of rebel groups and what they really want, more democratic versus autocratic, perhaps, structures of the rebel organization, and whether getting elite provisions is really backing down, or is that just posturing rhetoric, to help with that initial bargaining phase?
Sure. So the way we're thinking about standing firm or selling out is that usually the rebel groups start out as having sort of very broad claims about who they represent or what they want from the government. And at the end, in some agreements, we see that the concessions that they get are very limited, and in the sense that who will benefit from those concessions. And one potential is that having elite benefits such as direct representation in the government might be considered as something good, or that they can sell that to their constituency as something good. But still, if those things are happening in the absence of actual larger change to the political system, let's say in this example, then we still think that those are not necessarily directly benefiting to the public, but more a payoff to the elites and the leader. And for the different types of rebel groups, I think that's a good question, how different types might also affect. And I think we sort of a little bit bake that into the theoretical discussion of civilian reliance actually produces a different type of rebel structure as opposed to a rebel group that does not rely on civilians for their funding and resources. So we kind of, I think, maybe should flesh that out a little bit more. That one of the reasons why we expect this to be playing out this way is that having relying on civilians is changes how the joint governance structures within a rebel group emerge, and that the civilians' preferences will be more represented. And if you can think of other data sources that we can utilize, maybe to differentiate different types of rebel groups, that might be helpful too, if you know any.
Yeah, Gary, but we can't hear you. Gary, we can't hear you.
Oops.
Sorry. Just for some clarification on that. So even if one recruits from the population or gets resources from the population, that doesn't mean that's voluntary support, right? That can be coerced. And so even if, in some of these measures we see that you are recruiting from the population or have fighters from them, and that seems to be kind of a different theoretical take on what we're observing anyway. So I guess if you could perhaps talk a little bit more, and you started to at the end there, about the difference between actually relying on that voluntary support versus, you're drawing your fighters from this population just because you're poor, but you're stronger than the population.
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern in terms of how those processes play out on the ground, right? And the way we conceptualize as is more of a reliance, where there's a more mutual cooperative relationship between the rebel group and the civilians, but there are definitely more predatory rebel groups too. I think on the measurement side, we try to be very inclusive in how we use the EPR data, and also include the explicit support of those groups, not just the recruitment. But on the conceptual side, we also think of it as a more cooperative relationship. And I think this also gets to the issues with the measurement of the contraband funding, because in some cases, we think of contraband funding as sort of a negative thing, that the rebels use some resources available. But in some cases, actually, contraband funding can be resembling a more cooperative relationship too, as recruitment might be more of a coercive relationship. So I agree that that's a valid point, but maybe we should also make in the theory more clear what kind of a relationship that we're trying to capture.
Carla.
There we go. So hi, Deniz.
Hi.
So the one thing I'll tell you is, obviously I'm the discussant here who doesn't necessarily focus on peace building or civil war. So I think my comments are going to come more from just a general perspective, which I actually think this paper is, I love it. It's brilliant. Thank you for the opportunity for reading it. And I think it has a lot of appeal to a broader audience that goes beyond just the peace building literature. So I think one of the things that stood out to me, and I think a lot of my comments are going to be related to this, I think one potential missed opportunity you have here is that reading this, it reminded me a lot of selectorate theory, right? So the logic of political survival, Bueno de Mesquita et al., their idea about how you have a selectorate and a winning coalition, and how the leader has to basically give either public goods to everyone or private goods to the winning coalition, but essentially keep the support of the winning coalition to stay in power, right? And I think you guys are doing something similar, and maybe drawing an analogy to that would be something that would broaden the appeal, right? Because what you're doing here that I think is really novel is that you're showing that rebel leaders aren't just running around wild killing people, right? That they're following a lot of the same survival logic as traditional political leaders. And of course, there's also some differences, right, that you could highlight. And, as we continue, I'll talk a little bit about them. And something I like about what you did here is that you basically gave everyone agency, right? So the rebels have agency, the government has agency, but also the population. I think where there's room for you to expand a bit more is on the population, right? On the role of the civilian population, because I think there's variation in how much influence they can have. In other words, in how strong of a bargaining position they're in. And I have a bunch of points, and I'll email some of them to you. But for example, and this actually relates to logic of political survival, you can think a little bit about how well organized the civilian population is, right? So basically, if you think of them as negotiating as a bloc, how much can the bloc leaders negotiate on behalf of the population credibly, right? Because you assume the rebel leaders will push for these public goods when they know that in exchange they will get the support. But, you know, can they actually then get that? So I imagine that a population, maybe, I don't know, with better civil society is more able to extract these concessions. That's one point. I have a few others, but I'll kind of stop there and get some of your thoughts.
Great.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points that we can take the theory or expand a little bit where we can make it more appealing, and that would be desirable, obviously, on our part. And I agree that even within the groups that rely on civilians, there may be variation how much civilians still can impact the decision making. I'll have to think through how once we get into those differences within civilian organizations, how we can sort of both flesh out the theory and also maybe take the testing to the to another step and maybe see within those different groups and structures how that might impact. The reason I guess maybe we were sort of a little bit more reliance on civilians versus not is that we ultimately at the aggregate level of analysis have also fewer observations, but I think both theoretically how those mechanisms work, it would help us to draw on selector theory and also think about how different civilian populations may have a different impact. Yeah, those are good points.
Mike, what you got?
Am I on? Am I unmuted?
You're good.
Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation to discuss. I really like the paper a lot. I know, you know, we often say that, but here's what I really like about the paper, which is, you know, it's one of these results that makes a ton of sense, and something that we probably should have been thinking about a long time ago, right? That this idea that you know that there's probably something endogenous about the the content of the agreement, and problematizing it is pretty critical. And I think you've taken the right, step in this direction to try to deal with some of this. So I really like that a lot. In some ways the result's not earth shattering, but it's but it makes a ton of sense. And that's the type, to my mind, that's some of the best research, right? Is when you just you read it and you're like, yeah, that makes a ton of sense that they would care about, the public, the civilians, whatever, and that ought to go into what you would see out of things, right? So I like that a lot. So let me, so I have some theoretical comments and empirical comments. I guess in the spirit of we're kind of bouncing around a little bit, I'll just throw out one and then we'll come back. Is that kind of the way you like to do it, Emily? Okay. So, and then I can send comments afterwards as well. But on the theoretical side, so the government doesn't seem to be a real player here, at least the way that you've written it up, right? And it may be the case that the government is just very kind of in a straightforward way just responds to what the rebel groups want, when they negotiate, or when the demands that they make and such. But it seems like it might make sense to just theorize a little bit more about the government position in all this. And so, and I have no idea whether this is actually happening, but just to illustrate, right? I mean, I wonder if it's ever possible that the rebels always want to go after elite benefits, right? And they actually really don't care about the public. I mean, go with me on the argument here for a minute here, right? But the government realizing that actually the best way to solve this is actually to not sort of grant everything to the elites and actually give a whole bunch to the public, right? And so a story like that And so you might observe at the end of the day that, you know, some of these groups that rely on civilians and the public and such, they get agreements, right, that are in their favor. But it wasn't because of anything the rebel leadership tried to do, right? It's because the government sort of thought about like what the rebel leadership was demanding, and then sort of responded with concessions that maybe in part placated the rebel leadership, but maybe, you know, helped out the public more generally, right? So in that sense, yeah, it would, maybe the result could look consistent, but it would be a very different kind of theoretical process. And so, and I don't know if that's the story or if there's another story, but it might just be useful to draw out a little bit more of like how the government engages with the rebel group and what that process might look like. I'll stop there on that point.
Yeah, I agree that we sort of treat the government role of the government and their calculus and the impact of third parties sort of this alternative explanations, or how the design of the agreements might be impacted independent or in addition to the rebel leaders' decision making. And on the government side especially, we weren't sort of very we didn't have very strong expectations as to how these things will work, because and we write in the paper too about the effect of multiple other groups or the regime types might impact the design. But I agree that we don't get into how strategically government might also think their relation to this current group that they're negotiating with, and how they might try to counter their demands. And I can see sort of a scenario like you were putting forward, where they would try to counter or make the less costly concessions, expecting what the rebel leaders will demand. I think one thing we can do, both sort of in addition to improving the discussion on the government side, is, and I was wondering if anyone else would thought of this reading the article or the paper, is to show actually how different types of rebel groups that are not relying to civilians or having external sanctuaries actually sign agreements that are leader or group specific benefits, because we have that portion of the data in our data set. So, and we find when looking preliminary that those groups that have external support, for example, or external sanctuaries, actually have agreements that are more benefiting to the leader and the elite members. So that would sort of try to explain, it's not just that the state is giving those concessions, but also the ones that want elite benefits because they don't care about the civilians usually are also getting agreements with elite benefits, or the proportion of the concessions are for favoring elites and the leaders. So we can include that into the analysis. We were sort of getting to the point where everything was going to be too much for one paper, but we're also thinking about showing the other side of the story, how some groups might be getting different style agreements, and that's sort of maybe completes the story there and might address some of the questions that you had. But thank you.
Yeah, Carla.
It's kind of a 1.5 finger because it somewhat relates to some of Mike's points about the government. And I think one of my comments was also thinking about how maybe the government might also see some benefit to providing these public goods, or at least some types of governments, right? So I think you're right that in some situations, the public goods do threaten the preferential status of the government's essentially winning coalition, right? But I think there might be other cases in which it's a bit fuzzier, right? So both cases in which the government and the rebels are competing over the same constituents, right? You might have some people that support both the rebels and the government, right? Just turn around and support one day, the other. Or even some situations in which the government could potentially pitch the public goods as, you know, it's a public good for everyone because it brings us peace, right? Especially in conflicts in which the fighting is perhaps less well, less constrained to one area, and it's affecting even their own constituents directly. And so they could maybe pitch it as, well, we're not paying off corrupt leaders. We're reintegrating our population, bringing peace to everyone. This is good for everyone. And I think along those lines, something to think about. And as you said, a lot of this might end up being something for other papers. It's also maybe the power balance between the government and the rebel group at the time the settlement is reached, right? Because I was thinking about Monica Nalepa's skeletons in the closet, right? And how she talks about how that, I know Emily's smiling, I was her research assistant actually. But anyway, so how the power balance can shift by the time the agreement is being reached, right? And so maybe a government that is becoming weaker relative to the rebels might be more willing to give those concessions than one that is stronger. Again, something maybe even for future research.
Do you have a quick response? Yeah, there we go.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think that's a very good point that and that's something that I think moving forward we should include on the government side a little bit more nuanced discussion of the strategic thinking on the part of the state leaders, and potentially taking into account the power balance, or not just regime type, even though earlier versions of this paper had even a worse regime type measurement, and we're trying to improve that and flesh out how different regime types may impact the concessions, but also the relative power, or potentially the expectations about the future power setup. If it's going to be an open elections, then the government might be expecting to draw more from the rebel constituency, or similarly, that would impact the rebel leaders' calculus too. I think, power balance along with maybe the future expectations about the political system might help us tease out that better. Thank you.
Gary.
So my one finger, I think, turned into almost a two finger here then. Because one of the things that I was thinking about as this discussion's going on and in reading the paper was this idea that we often think that agreements kind of reflect the balance of power should war restart, right? And in the theory right now, it's how much do the leaders decide to take for themselves versus give to the public without this thought about the cost of the actual conflict, or who's paying those costs, so, right? I think, right, as Carla just mentioned, how widespread the violence is, or the tactics the government's using. Is it targeting civilians? What is it doing? But going more into kind of a bargaining framework with what could the rebels demand, and what do they demand, given their strength? And I think you've set it up where for the government, and this is kind of the point that's been being discussed, that for the government, you have it set up that the public offerings are always more costly. And if you keep that assumption in there, if you get groups that are just, they're getting more of those concessions, is that because they're stronger because they're drawing on more of the population, or what exactly is happening there? Taking these demands back to kind of that bargaining model framework. So I think that's been discussed in a few different ways there, but that was kind of along the lines I was thinking as well.
I think my takeaway from this discussion is that potentially we can discuss a little bit more why we think, or how we frame this as sort of selling out or versus standing firm, and underlying our mechanism and the theoretical expectation is that we think some of the groups won't necessarily want those larger concessions as opposed to other ones, but I think it will be helpful once we get back to working on it and think through how the state also plays into it. We always thought of state as sort of like in relation to the other groups and underlying sort of costs of making concessions. But yeah, I think some of those additional things will help us a lot.
I'm going to insert myself here as the proxy for Lindsay Reed at UC Davis. And she sent a bunch of comments, and again, I will send all of them to you afterward. But so she asks, she says, from my perspective, meaning Lindsay's perspective, a problem that plagues the negotiations in peace agreement literature is that we can't really observe what goes on during negotiations. We can only use the final written agreement to make assumptions about what happened and how actors negotiated. So with that in mind, to what extent do you think rebel leaders have full control over the settlement design? If you're arguing that they can use it strategically, then they have to actually be able to manipulate it. So depending on factors like relative rebel strength, likelihood of defeat or victory, or pressure by outside actors, do rebel leaders find their hands tied to sign whatever is on the table? So do they actually have the agency to design a settlement that reflects their constituents' preferences, or do they have to take whatever they're offered? So take the example of power sharing provisions. Power sharing is applied in a lot of cases. Some settlements then may appear audience focused, but in fact, it may be that the rebel leaders don't care about the wide audience, but they're agreeing to a standard package of peace agreement provisions. So how do you theoretically and empirically grapple with the possibility that what you view in the peace agreement is not a reflection of the strategic calculus of the rebel groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are two answers to this question. One is empirically, unfortunately, we don't have all the potential agreements that could have been signed, or all the demands that were put forward, and then how much that was agreed upon. So it would have been nice if we had that process. In some cases, the negotiations happen a little bit more public than we usually think. That there are a lot of news coverage that one can tease out some of those, what was the back and forth between the combatants. But then again, in other cases, it's usually closed doors and for many reasons, and it's sometimes preferred to keep it a little bit secret. So across the board, I don't think there is a reasonable way for us yet to be able to get that information and then have an actual test of how much out of the demands that the rebel made that they got, or if they made those demands. And on the theoretical side, that's also why in general we assume that these demands are or how rebel groups start out as making large demands. And there are reasons for making large demands at the start of the conflict, where they're trying to draw support, but then as conflict progresses, maybe their reliance on that larger support dwindles, or they don't necessarily need it because they have other sources, external supporters, or natural resources that they don't necessarily as reliant on those groups. But then again, of course, we don't have on the empiric side that piece of critical information for us to be able to tease that out. And also another issue is how much control the leaders have. Maybe they're signing on to agreements that they have to. And it may be for some cases, but I still think they do have a certain amount of influence on what they get on the table. Especially these are the cases where it ends in a negotiated settlement, where the settlement itself is substantive one way or the other. Sometimes it benefits public more, sometimes not, but then they're still getting some concessions, which suggests that they came to table with some set of demands, and that they're getting at least, if not all, some of those, and that should reflect the type of demands that they put forward on the table, theoretically speaking. And that's our starting point, how we start the theory. But it's a good question, and it's a difficult question to handle, and empirically and theoretically. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, Mike, and then Carla.
Just one final point on this. I wonder if just as a even as a first step or kind of small step here, get a database of, and I think there's people out there that have this. I can't remember anyway, but like a peace negotiations database or something, and then this wouldn't solve everything, but to go back to the date of the first negotiation and then just try to track from there. You might be able to get some indication of what those early discussions look like. you know, I think there's a fair amount. A number of years ago, I had some coders and then ended up not doing anything with it, but just ended up having coders go through UCDP, you know, the summaries and just and pull out negotiations. And in almost all the conflicts, there were lots and lots of stuff that were listed as negotiations with a little bit of discussion about kind of like what was being discussed and such. Again, you know, I don't know that you could do anything kind of like large or maybe quantitative or build it all in or whatever, but it might be a way to kind of investigate for some key examples or something, right? Like, what did the discussion look like before you got further down the road and ended up with whatever you ended up with in the final database?
That's a good idea. Yeah, we can definitely look into it and maybe include some examples at the very least for the discussion.
Carla.
Okay. So actually, one point I had, and this actually was actually one of Gary's points that brought it to mind. So he was talking about repression, right? And I mean, in all honesty, I think you might have an entirely different paper here, just talking about the civilians and how much they are able to control their government, the rebels, right? So how much influence the civilians can have over the rebels. And I think that point of repression is one of them, right? Because you want to think about when the civilians are pushing for whatever concessions they want, for whatever public goods they want, what's their outside option, right? So how credibly can they tell the rebels, we'll stop supporting you if you don't give us what we want? And I think thinking a little bit about how repressive is the government towards civilians, and therefore potentially how dependent have the civilians become on the rebel group for protection, right? Because if they're very reliant on them, then they don't have an outside option. They may get fewer of these public goods. I mean, of course, moderated by all these other ethnic factors, etc. And this also gets back to you had a point about the number of rebel groups, right? So if there's competing rebel groups competing for these constituencies, could that maybe also give the civilians more influence, right? They have a credible outside option. And so, I don't know, just throwing out some points that you might want to think about.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things we sort of started discussing and looking into, if there are other groups, especially drawing support from the same ethnic group using the EPR data set. And we started compiling the data in such a way that we can also measure if there's ethnic competition for the support of the same, or if there's competition for the support of the same ethnic group, which was one of the things that we wanted to explore in the future, because then they may be sort of, the rebel groups might be more incentivized to appear as they're the ones who are providing more public goods, as opposed to the other rebel group that's competing along the lines of the other groups that are outside the peace process. So that was one thing we were sort of toying with the idea, but yeah, I agree.
Gary.
So, you know, as this discussion's been unfolding, the thing that seems to keep coming up are what the original goals of the rebels are. And this is not just in terms of whether to get public, goods for the public or not, but I'm thinking like secession versus taking the center. Is this for your particular, I know this bleeds a little bit into coding, but is it for your ethnic group or your religious group, or, are you an exclusionary or an inclusive group? And as I'm listening to this conversation, I think it's more and more important to really identify what you believe the goals are. And I know that there's this idea that, well, we might want to apply broadly to get more fighters or more resources. But I think that's different than goals, right? That's more of a strategy than a goal. So, if groups win the war, or if they get into government, oftentimes they govern autocratically anyway, even with these provisions. And so it's like, how much is that really giving back to this population? So I know, I guess there's also somewhat, as I mentioned, a question about data. Krista Wiegand here at Tennessee, right? She's working on a project about rebel goals that might be useful on the measurement side. But on the theory side, right? What are we actually getting with the difference between, do I actually want this thing? Do I need this thing? Am I willing to actually enforce it after the agreement signed. It seems like we don't have a good initial starting point to what the groups want, and thus where they bargain from there, kind of going back to Mike's point as well, as going through that negotiation phase.
Yeah, so I think our starting position is more along the lines of what it's not more along the lines of what they want, but more about what they need and what they need to maintain both their political and military power as the conflict ends, but also as they transition into politics. So it may be that they want more, but that they don't need that, or they don't expect to be in a position where they're fighting in or competing in elections, or it may be that actually they did not start out as such like press, and now they're in transition to they're transitioning into the political life. They expect that the elections will be more important, therefore they turn back to their support base to maintain that. So I think our position is more about how they wage the war and how they maintain that political and military power, and how they think, or at least how leaders think they can transition that into the post-conflict, and also how they sort of navigate the uncertainties during negotiations. But I think the original goals of the group, granted, are also important. Probably some of them may not want to make certain demands, period, and that affects the baseline of how many demands they'll make or what types of demands they'll make. I think I'll definitely check out Krista's data, and maybe we can sort of see what we can do with that. But on the theory side, I think we're still sort of on sort of our starting point is sort of, in general, groups make those larger claims, and then at the end we see very different outcomes. And I think I'm sort of more comfortable making that than other assumptions about how the groups start out. But we also thought about, and that gets back to the goals and what types of demands the groups make, using Jacana's data, Jacana Thomas' data on rebel demands. It's only the African rebel groups, but we're at least planning to have that as one of the controls of number of demands that they made throughout the conflict, as an indicator of maybe potentially how many or the proportion of the public goods type of concessions that they eventually get. But that would almost half our sample too. But it's something we thought we should have at the end as a maybe robustness check at the worst case scenario. But yeah.
Mike.
Maybe I have a few empirical comments. Maybe I can make those now.
Yeah, that's okay.
First off, I thought the empirical section explained really well. And I absolutely love it when people do things like give examples of like low and high values on the dependent variable, which you guys did with Congo and Sudan. I just think that, I mean, knowing our data and helping readers understand it is so important, and yet we just don't very often. So thank you for writing a great section here. So a few things, and so one is like the scale of the, what, let's say, like the, what the agreement is giving to like elite is what it is to the broader public, right? And so, and how to maybe capture that, because I suppose one could imagine an agreement in which like there's only a single thing given to the public, but it happens to be absolutely massive, right? In terms of like how it affects the public, and then there's a whole bunch of like really small things that are given to the leaders. Something like that, I think, would get wouldn't show up in your result the way you've coded it proportionally, as I understand it, right? And so I'm curious if you're able to capture some of that in the coding that you did for the database here, and if there's a way to think about weighting somehow the measure of like what public's getting versus the leaders and whatnot. So on the proxies, like on the ethnicity one, it got me wondering whether why is ethnicity somehow different than say a religious group? Would we really expect that the ethnicity is the right way to go to sort of think about like reliance on the public and so forth? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not sure, but it seems like you could have different, you could have ethnic, different sort of structures for ethnic groups there. And maybe and I recall that, with the data you're using, there were like 3 different criteria here. And so maybe you're able to, distinguish on some of these things, but it wasn't immediately evident to me why ethnicity is the right way to go with it. And this got me thinking, and I don't know this data set well, but I read, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but Reiko Huang at A&M has a data set where she's trying to capture a lot of similar things to what you're talking about here, I think, right? And if you may have already seen it, but if you haven't, I would just maybe take a look at it and see. And and I don't think I think it was a difficult task even in her case as well, but she had some other measures that I think didn't rely on ethnicity, but still tried to get at things like getting support from the group and and things like that. So I've been going on for a long time. Can I say just one last thing though, which is it's back on this issue of like what doesn't get signed. I kept wondering whether like the selection model is right the way you do it, because it's like the agreement and the content of whether an agreement gets signed and then the content of the agreement are like just wrapped up in each other, and I mean just it seem completely endogenous to each other, and so that might get difficult in a selection. It's almost like, and I don't know if this is right, but it got me thinking: do you want like a first step, do you enter into negotiations, and then as a second step, one way could be, do you sign an agreement? But another one could be, you get into negotiations, and then what's the content of the agreement or something. So it seems like there's different ways to model that, and that connects to the earlier discussion. And maybe the data just aren't, good enough on the negotiation side of things. And then one final point here, which is, it seems like a really cool testable implication, if you could get the negotiation stuff, would be what happens when you have a rebel group in which the leaders are highly dependent on the the civilian population or whatever, they're the rank and file, and yet they try to get an agreement that cuts out the rank and file. What happened? Like, does the agreement fail, or like do the negotiations fail over something like that, right? So what happens when there's a mismatch in what they should be doing and what they actually do? Do you observe that the negotiations fail, or the agreement, or and it might be pre-agreement, it might be the durability of the agreement or whatever. So I threw out a lot. Sorry.
Deniz.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I'll go in order. And in terms of the scale, how big each given concession is, unfortunately, we don't have that data. So we look at each of those provisions, let's say electoral reform and code, opening up elections to other parties as like a potential benefit to the public. But that along with additional reforms to the political system that that take into account fundamental freedoms and other things are also potential benefits to the and those two things are regarded same essentially, or have the same weight in terms of two benefits for public out of however many other concessions were to the group. So it's true that some of those may have more weight than the others, but unfortunately the underlying data don't have that scale of how big or small the concession was. It's potentially a good addition to the data, and I can see how that might differ, even though you have one concession, maybe that was a very big concession. It's unfortunately practically, when I started the data coding, had ambitions to have those scales and other things, but in the end it didn't happen because it was getting a very big project. So maybe for the future iterations of data, that might be one thing to think about. But one thing we can do, and I think Gary had an earlier comment that I wanted to also mention and forgot. One thing we have is the costs. So we code the costs if a provision is costly to the rebel group, and which of the constituency is essentially paying the costs. For example, if it's demobilization, the rank and file is paying the costs of those provisions. So we want to play around a little bit more in terms of maybe getting a more net benefit type of measure as an alternative to the current measures that we have. What we also take into account which of the audience members are paying most the costs of the piece. And maybe that way we can actually get a little bit better measure. Ethnicity versus religion, I'll check the data that you mentioned, Mike. It's always good to have alternatives and like potentially better ways of measuring. Capture ethnicity was one thing that the data is available in there, that we can link the rebel groups to the ethnic groups easily. And in general, theoretically, when we're thinking about support from groups, there are other works that look at the homogeneous structure of the civilians and how that affects rebel governance, and we briefly talk about that. So we thought ethnicity is a good indicator and a good proxy, but I take it that we should also maybe elaborate a little bit more on why we picked that proxy. And yeah, I think we can definitely look into the cases in the data and see what happens when so we'll look into that. I think that's a good idea to look.
It's about time to wrap it up. And so if anybody has some last minute points they want to make sure to make, we can take those. All right. Thank you, Deniz, for sharing this paper with us. Thank you very much to all of our discussants for taking the time to read the paper and give great comments and feedback. And if anyone who's watching wants to see the paper, hi, Eloise. If there's anyone who wants to take a look, the paper is up on our website, and you're welcome to contact Deniz and Alyssa to give them some feedback and respond to things we've talked about here. And so with that, this is the end of the semester. We're going to have a new call for papers at the online Peace Science Colloquium. So remind your friends and neighbors to submit a paper, and we will have a great next semester.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the comments.